Good evening, my good brothers and sisters. I'm looking forward to our time studying together tonight. Today is Mother's Day, and I do hope that all of our mothers have had a wonderful day and that you've been able to enjoy some good time with your family, even though our circumstances are so very unusual. But I hope that you've had a chance to kind of maybe even take a little nap this afternoon, and now you're up and alert. And what better way to conclude a Mother's Day than by learning biblical context? Well, we are going to talk about context tonight because tonight we are talking about the second major step of how to study the Bible. As you recall, we've talked in our previous lessons about the importance of just carefully reading and observing what is in the text, looking for the basic pieces of information, the who, what, when, where kind of pieces of information. And we did that in a very thorough way, going through the book of Philemon as an example. Well, now we're going to move to the second phase of Bible study, which is to begin to try to piece together the meaning of the text. What did this mean to the readers? What are we supposed to understand about this text? And in order to do that, really, context is key. Context is key. We all know that one of the greatest dangers of poor Bible study is to take passages out of their context. Well, how do we avoid making that mistake? How can we put biblical passages in their context so that we correctly and accurately interpret them? Well, in this lesson, we're going to talk about two basic kinds of context. One kind of context we maybe could call the literary or the biblical context. That's when we're going to look at a passage in the light of the surrounding verses, chapters, and books of the Bible. And then another kind of context we might call the cultural or the historical context. And that's the kind of context in which we want to understand what was life like in the time in which this book was written. And those two kinds of context will give us the tools that we need to know how to correctly interpret the Bible. So let's talk a little bit about his biblical context, literary context, putting passages in their context in terms of how they fit into what is around them. And I want to use as an example a passage found over in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So would you look with me at 1 Corinthians 7? We're going to come back and look at Philemon here in just a minute. But I want to go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and I want to just snatch a verse right out of its context, read it on its own terms, and then apply the lessons of looking at what's going on around it. Okay? So 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 8. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 8, the Apostle Paul says, "To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am." It's good for them to remain single as I am. Now, of course, as we try to understand what Paul means by that statement, are we to understand that Paul is saying in a blanket, absolute, and unconditional sense that he thinks it would be better for people not to marry, that they remain single? Well, in order to understand what that verse means, we need to look at it in light of the verses that are around it. That's its most immediate context, right? And if you just glance back up the page, back up to verses 3, 4, and 5, Paul seems to say things in this passage that seem very favorable to marriage. He says in verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. It talks about how the wife and the husband each have no real independent right to their own body, but should give themselves freely to each other. It talks in verse 5 about not depriving one another, except for a limited time. So in the verses before what we just read in verse 8, Paul seems to think that marriage is okay. And then if we drop down to verse 26, we have a key time frame. So remember we talked about, as you're looking for the basic pieces of data in a text, one kind of data is, are there any chronological details, time frames of some sort? And we have a time frame, right, in verse 26. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. So what we learn is that there was actually a qualifying statement to what Paul says in verse 8. When he talks about the preference to remain single, that has to be read in light of what's going on around that passage, and in particular, Paul's otherwise favorable comments about marriage earlier in the chapter, and his limiting detail of a present distress as that which is guiding his counsel here in this chapter, right? So that's context. We'll call that the biblical or literary context. Looking at the passage in light of what's before it and what is after it. Another kind of biblical context is to think about other books the same writer has written, to see how to measure what verse 8 says. So, for example, we might think about other places where Paul has talked about marriage. Now, how would we find those? Well, one way we could find them is if our Bible has cross-references, to look at his references to marriage and to husbands and wives, and see if we have any cross-references to other books that the Apostle Paul wrote. Another way we could do this is to use some kind of concordance. We don't even hardly use that word anymore, do we? Because we Google everything now. Google, which is a specific brand, has also just become a generic term, right, for searching for something. So for those of you who are young whippersnappers and you don't know what a concordance is, a concordance was Google before there was Google, except it was for the Bible. It's when you could look up words as they appear in Scripture. And of course, now we have at our fingertips really powerful concordances. I used to have those big, cumbersome physical copies. Now you can go on to like BibleGateway.com and do a search, and you can even select what books that you want to search. The other thing that helps to provide some biblical context is just reading through the Bible. That's one of the reasons why I really hope you're doing the daily Bible reading program that we've been talking about this year, or some kind of regular time reading in the Bible, because it helps to kind of broaden your base of understanding of the biblical text. So I bet you know off the top of your head at least one other place in the New Testament where Paul talks about marriage, right? Ephesians 5, and in Ephesians 5, talk about a high view of marriage. He compares the relationship of Christ and the church to that of a husband and wife, right? That would certainly be odd if Paul's absolute unqualified attitude about marriage was we really shouldn't do it. And then over in 1 Timothy 4, Paul says that people who forbid marriage are teaching a demonic doctrine. That's pretty stout language, right? So, knowing that Paul has a positive view of marriage overall gives us some clues that this statement here in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 8 should not be seen as a blanket statement, not to mention the factors that we already talked about in the immediate context in 1 Corinthians 7. And in addition to the immediate context, the larger context of, say, other books that writer has written, another kind of context is just reading a passage in light of the whole story of the Bible. So remember, we've talked in a previous lesson about seeing the Bible as a big story. And of course, like, how does the Bible story start? With creation, which is good. And one of the key features of creation is marriage. God's creation of man and woman to be together in marriage. So those are the kinds of qualifying details that come from the biblical context that help us to understand that what Paul was saying here in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 8 is not seen as an absolute. So then let's think about Philemon just for a minute in terms of its context. So when we turn back over to Philemon, of course, it's just this one chapter. And it does seem kind of odd, right, that we have this one letter that's just addressed to a person. I mean, even though Timothy and Titus are written to a person, at least there's instructions for, congregational order in those books. This seems like a purely personal letter. So how would we even go about trying to find a context for this book? Well, again, we can use tools like cross-references or like a concordance and search for the name of Philemon, which is not going to turn up a whole lot of other information. But if we did a search for one of the other key characters in this book, Onesimus, we're going to turn something up. For example, in my Bible, my cross-referencing system, at Philemon verse 10, on the name Onesimus, points me back to the book of Colossians. So if I turn back over to Colossians and I look in Colossians in chapter 4, Paul says that he is sending Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. Whoa, that really opens up some information here, right? Because it indicates where Philemon is, right? If Onesimus is one of the Colossians and Onesimus is from the household of Philemon, then guess where Philemon must be? So you see how that one little cross-reference actually enables us to really have some major pieces of the puzzle that were missing when we did our scan of Philemon really start to kind of come into place. And then if you were to go on and read the next few verses in Colossians 4, you're going to find that a lot of those same people we made note of at the end of Philemon, who are with Paul as his fellow workers and a fellow prisoner of Paul, are also mentioned with him as he writes to the Colossians. So now we've been able to kind of enlarge our understanding of Philemon by at least pinpointing where he is. He is in the city of Colossae. That is where Onesimus is from. All right, so that gives you an example of how you would kind of do the work of biblical context, literary context. Quite honestly, one of my favorite things to do when I am teaching any book of the Bible, certainly a large one, but really any book of the Bible, is I love to just try to do word searches on the words that I see that keep coming up just to try to pinpoint how many of them there are. Incidentally, an ace Bible student among us, who would certainly be embarrassed if I should reveal his identity, I'll just say he is a frequent Gold Star Bible student, sent me an email after Wednesday night's class and said that as he was reading through Philemon, that the word brother really stood out to him, that the word brother is found 6 times in this letter, which again, the number 6 is not a huge number, but in a small book, it really seemed quite interesting that the word brother came up in this book. And I think there might be a good reason for that. When you see terminology that really comes up frequently, it certainly should make you start to think about, okay, why would this biblical writer in this situation emphasize that term so much? All right, so then, in addition to the biblical context, remember there is another kind of historical context. The other kind of, there's another kind of context, which is the historical context. So what does that mean? Well, God communicated his word in real time. It doesn't just kind of float up in heaven, isolated from everything. God's word was given in real time, and it was given to real people in real circumstances. So what we want to try to do is understand what were those circumstances like. In the case of the Corinthians, what was it like to live in Corinth in the time of the first century when Paul wrote? And in particular, turning back over to 1 Corinthians, I'm really curious as to what Paul may have in mind here when he talks about this present distress in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 26. Now, I am 100% sure the Corinthians knew, based on the fact that Paul says it to them, and they're supposed to learn and clue in, from his usage of that phrase. I'm also 100% certain none of us know what he meant, all right? So how would we even begin trying to find out? Well, certainly we could read through the book and see if Paul in any other place mentions any kind of serious crisis, persecution, a famine, some kind of economic catastrophe. And if you do that in 1 Corinthians, I don't think that you're really going to find a whole lot that would add any information to give you any clues. But the other thing we can do is we can look up resources which give us background information about the Bible. So what kind of resources are those? Well, things like Bible dictionaries and Bible encyclopedias. Just like there are encyclopedias about general knowledge, like the Encyclopedia Britannica, there are encyclopedias of biblical knowledge that really focus in on the people, places, and events in the cities and places mentioned in the Bible. So you could look up maybe a Bible encyclopedia article about the city of Corinth. Another thing you could do is turn to a commentary. So what is a commentary? Well, when I teach, I'm giving you my commentary. It's just not written down unless I hand out some notes. So this is a commentary that I have on 1 Corinthians. So I know who wrote it, Richard Oster, and I kind of have some idea his general perspective on things. So I'm going to go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and I'm going to look up what he says about this present distress or present crisis in verse 26. He says this, since Paul does not, at least in this verse, interpret or explain what the present crisis is, interpreters have never been inhibited in putting forward numerous suggestions and explanations of the phrase, some obviously more plausible than the others. And then at the end of the paragraph, he says he thinks what Paul is talking about is just the general sense of uncertainty of waiting for the coming of Christ. Now, remember what I said to you in the previous lesson, that lessons, when you look at a commentary, you're looking at somebody's very studied, carefully thought out views of a text, but you always need to ask yourself the question, do I agree? I see your arguments, do I agree? Now, in this case, my actual opinion is no, I do not agree with Dr. Oster. I don't think that Paul is just talking in general terms about waiting for the coming of Christ, if for no other reason than in Ephesians, which is written right about the same time, he has a very high view of marriage. He doesn't say anything at all about limiting marriage in view of a present distress. So that leads me to think that it was something localized and specific at Corinth. So the best I think you can hope for in a really good commentary, when you come to a passage like this, is that a really good commentary will spell out, here are the different options, here are the strengths and weaknesses of each, and then here's what I think. I do that a lot, quite honestly, in class. And what you want is a good commentary to do the same thing, because it may be the case that the position he lands on or she lands on is not the one you like, but they gave enough good information about other possibilities that helps you make a decision, maybe to agree with one of those. But that's what a commentary is. It's somebody's studied opinion, and you should always ask, do I agree or do I disagree? All right, now then, with regard, to the book of Philemon, in the handout that I sent you all for last time, I pointed out some resources that are available. BibleGateway.com not only has a concordance feature, you can search for words and phrases, but they also have other Bible study resources, which are very good. They have some Bible encyclopedias and some commentaries. Now, I do need to say up front, a lot of times, the resources that you can find that are for free, that are commentaries and Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias, are free for a reason. They were written 200 years ago, and the copyright has expired. And there's nothing wrong with reading things written 200 years ago. I mean, we're reading the Bible, and it's thousands of years old in some instances. But just be aware that over the last 200 years, there have been a lot of developments in archaeology and in our background understanding the biblical text, and there's been a lot of research done. And it's kind of like there's nothing wrong with reading a 200-year-old encyclopedia, but it's not going to say anything about space travel, right? So it's good to have access to up-to-date resources, and that often costs money, all right? But it just so happens there are a couple of free resources on BibleGateway.com that I linked to you to take a look at. One is called the Zondervan Bible Encyclopedia, and it's a wonderful set and has a lot of really good, helpful information. And the other resource that I linked to you is something called the IVP, that stands for InterVarsity Press, which is a publication company up in the Chicago area, not far from where I used to preach in Elgin. And InterVarsity Press has a commentary series of fairly brief commentaries on the New Testament. Not all of the books are covered, but quite a lot of them are. And the ones that they do have available are there on the BibleGateway.com website. So I ask you to consider using those resources to try to get more information about the book. So, here's what I found. When I went to the encyclopedia entry on the book of Philemon, I learned some interesting things. I learned that this is the shortest of Paul's letters, although, I guess that was pretty obvious if you just think about it, right, compared to his other letters. There was background information about Roman law with regard to slavery. Did you read the same thing I did, that Roman law required that whoever gave hospitality to a runaway slave was liable for each day's lost wages? So if Paul was giving Onesimus cover, then legally, depending on how that worked with Paul's imprisonment, Paul may have been legally liable had Philemon wanted to pursue the matter. Also, there were penalties for those who gave shelter to runaway slaves. Also, the encyclopedia entry on the book of Philemon mentioned Colossians 4 and the same people that are mentioned in each text. So if you missed that in a cross-reference or just in your general knowledge of Colossians, and you didn't see it in a concordance search, it's great to have a resource, right, that would point that out to you. The encyclopedia entry also talked about possible locations for Paul's imprisonment, which is not named. We have learned that Philemon and Onesimus are from Colossae, but we don't know where Paul was. So the encyclopedia article talked about Rome as one possible option, and the other possible option was Ephesus. And then, as a good resource should do, it explained kind of the reasoning behind each. It came down on the side of the Roman imprisonment, which is what I also think, but it also gave you the option to consider the Ephesian imprisonment. The encyclopedia article also talked about how Paul deals with the institution of slavery, which was not to just sweep it away with a revolutionary, sweep of the pen, but instead to create a cultural environment among Christians in which the institution would just kind of wilt and die on the vine, so to speak. The encyclopedia article also gave some alternate views of the reconstruction we've done of the story of Philemon, and suggested maybe other people were the slave owners. The encyclopedia article didn't seem to find that very convincing, and neither did I, but I thought it was interesting to kind of consider that as an alternative. So some really cool information, a lot of which is just not accessible. I mean, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not an expert on first century Rome. So it was just kind of neat to see that information. And then I asked you to read a small section from the commentary, and I had a specific reason in mind to ask you that. In Philemon, in verse 21, Paul says this: "Confident of your obedience, I write to you, knowing that you will do even more than I say." Now, Paul doesn't spell out what he means when he says, confident you will do even more than I say. So I'm curious, what does he mean? And a good commentary will explain its position on what it thinks Paul means, give you some options. And so if you go to the commentary, did you pick up on what the commentator believes Paul wants Philemon to do? What the commentator said is that Paul wants Philemon to set Onesimus free. Now, unfortunately, the commentary used a very technical term, manumission. I mean, we don't use that word at all, right? Partly because we don't have a slave culture. Manumission is just a fancy way of saying setting a slave free. And so the commentator was arguing that he thinks that Paul wants Philemon not simply to receive Onesimus back, but then also to let him go as a slave. All right, so that gives you an idea of how you would use some of these non-biblical resources. Again, remember, as helpful as these resources are, their purpose is to help you understand the Bible. And it is the Bible which is the final authority. All of these other things are just simply tools or aid to help us see the final authority. Now, with that all in mind, I want to just kind of conclude this lesson by putting together sort of a broad interpretive picture of what's going on here in the book of Philemon. We've done the diligent work of scoping through the text to get all the pieces of information we can. We've then tried to put this letter in context of Paul's other letters. and also the first century historical situation, particularly with the help of a commentary and an encyclopedia. And so now then we're going to try to figure out, okay, what did this mean to Philemon? What is Paul's purpose? How are we supposed to understand this letter? So here's what I think we can put together. Onesimus was a slave. Paul seems to say that in verse 16 when he talks about him being more than a bondservant. He was a slave who had left. And it doesn't seem as if he had left with Philemon's permission. Otherwise, why would Paul be sending him back? In fact, it seems as if he left under very shaky circumstances, because in verse 18, Paul asks or says, if he has wronged you at all, I'll pay it off. So Onesimus apparently left under circumstances in which he even wronged Philemon. Not only that, if you think about some of the details we talked about, that it isn't even until verse 17 that Paul even spells out what he wants. Whatever these circumstances were circumstances such that Paul went through a great deal of diplomacy and careful preparation before he made the request. We also know, based on verse 10 and verse 11, that Onesimus ended up wherever Paul was, whether it was Rome or Ephesus. I think maybe Rome, but it's not really material to this point. And in ending up wherever Paul was, Onesimus became a Christian. Yeah, he becomes Paul's son or child in the faith. And that's why Paul says to Philemon that he's more than a bondservant, he's your brother, and you can have him forever in that relationship. Now that Onesimus has become a Christian, he still remains a slave who has run away. And so Paul sends him back to Philemon and is wanting Philemon to, in verse 17, receive him back. Receive him back. In other words, if this relationship ruptured, Onesimus runs away, Paul now wants Philemon to receive him back and for that relationship to somehow be restored. And then Paul offers to, pay whatever cost has been incurred, which, as you remember from our study of the encyclopedia, could have potentially been pretty significant. But Paul says he's willing even to pay that. Now then, if Paul wants Philemon to receive back this runaway slave who has become a Christian, what would be left to be what Paul wants him to do when he talks about in verse 21, knowing that you will do even more than I say? What would be more than receiving him back? What would be more than forgiving him? Well, on this point, I agree with the suggestion of the commentary. I do think that what Paul is saying is that he wants Philemon to set Onesimus free. And that was also the suggestion of the encyclopedia article. He's creating an environment in which this master will have really no choice by moral compulsion, not by apostolic order, but by moral compulsion to set this slave free for purposes that Paul has kind of hinted at, right? When he talks about, back up in verse 13, to be a fellow worker with him in the gospel, which, by the way, if you remember from Colossians 4, is exactly how he describes Onesimus in that passage. So there you have it. That's our crash course in Bible interpretation, which really consists of trying to put a passage in its context. In the biblical context, the verses around it and the books around it and the whole story of the Bible, and then also putting a passage in its historical or cultural context, trying to see what the world was like for those people to whom this passage was first given, so we can make good interpretation of it. Well, that's going to do it for this class. Now, we have one more step to go, remember, which is application, which is going to be kind of interesting, I think, to contemplate with Philemon, because after all, as I said a minute ago, it's unusual that there should be a book written to one person. And yet it seems as if the Lord has some purpose for us to make of this book. So what we're going to do for the next lesson, if the Lord wills, is try to think about how to apply the message of an apostle to a slave owner about a slave, how do we apply that to our own circumstances? That's what we'll look at in our next study. Hope you all have a great evening, and I'll see you, Lord willing, on Wednesday.